in just a moment, we're going to have our colleagues Toshi Hu and Ben Hamamoto come onto the stage. And as we introduce them, one of the things that we're going to be doing is taking a look at one industry in particular that we see changing. And in this case, we're going to be focusing on our media industry, on sort of Hollywood and on popular media as a sector overall. And we know as we're doing that, we are going to see very different kinds of disruptions and changes and transformations, probably across different industries, as pharmaceuticals and education and manufacturing have generative AI and classical AI emerging into them. But one of the things that the popular science fiction author and friend of the Institute, Bruce Sterling, often says is that whatever happens to musicians will eventually happen to everybody. And we think that's true for artists in general. And so we're going to take two different looks now through highlights from other interviews that we've been conducting with experts and folks really engaged on the front lines of this debate, and to talk about different sides of where is media being disrupted and what can we maybe learn about that in terms of where AI is going to see other areas. So I would like to invite to the stage to help us do that, Research Director Ben Hamamoto and Director of our Emerging Media Lab and my co-host for our Vantage Emerging Media Tech Council, Toshi Hu. Hey guys.
Hey Dylan. Morning.
Thanks for the virtual applause.
We're going to start with you, Ben. So recently you had an interview with Madeline Ashby, right? And help set that up for us, what we're going to hear from Madeline.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. So I talked with Madeline Ashby mostly about an article that she recently wrote for Wired that's called Hollywood's Future Belongs to People, Not Machines, which is about the SAG and WGA strikes. And I'm pretty sure everybody watching this knows that these strikes are happening. You know, they've seen it in the news. They've maybe seen some famous faces on the picket lines. But, you know, despite the fact that this is such a high profile strike and an event, a news story, it's also, you know, a pretty complex and nuanced story. And so if you want to really understand what's going on with these strikes, Madeline's article is just a really well written and maybe more importantly, well reported article that, you know, she put together over several months. She talked to numerous sources across the industry, talked to a lot of the real life people being impacted directly over an extended period of time. And so she has that, you know, on the ground view of, you know, kind of both the trees, but also the forest, you know, by talking to so many people across the industry. And I think, you know, she brings this really holistic perspective to the piece, partly, you know, because in addition to being a fiction writer and a reporter and just a really thoughtful and insightful person, as you mentioned, Dylan, she's also a professional futurist, you know, who's a friend of the Institute, who's, you know, worked with us for, I think, about as long as, you know, the 10 or so years that I've been here at IFTF. And so, you know, she did kind of both give this very grounded perspective, but also, I think, kind of put it in the context of the larger past, present, and future. And so as you mentioned, you know, Dylan, we did just hear from Raina and Duran about kind of the 30,000 foot view and about how historically, you know, to the extent that when tech gets adopted and advances, that it benefits society broadly, it only does so thanks to kind of the efforts and struggles of labor and, you know, political struggle. And it really does seem like, you know, this might be a moment right now, kind of a hinge point where we're having this first big public labor fight around AI, you know, and so something that potentially could be written about in future histories. And so talking to Madeline really kind of helped me understand this context better and understand the stakes for the next decade, not just for the entertainment industry, but for labor more generally and the diverging paths we could be on.
Excellent. And yeah, as futurists, one of the things that we often do when we're trying to sort of analyze and assess different kinds of disruption is we have this framework developed by Ian Morrison, one of the former leaders of IFTF, called the sort of two curve framework that looks at sort of the first curve that's often sort of the traditional way of doing things that declines as disruption comes in, and then the second curve that emerges as people adapt to the new assumptions and the new ways of doing things. And really, I think what I got out of the interview with Madeline was really looking at what does this disruption look like from the point of view of this traditional industry that has a long history in America that is being disrupted, and really that's also not just now being disrupted for the first time, but that this is a long chain of disruptions, right? So let's take a look.
So the Wired article in question is called Hollywood's Future Belongs to People, Not Machines. And it was written during the time of the WGA the Writers Guild of America strikes, as well as what became the SAG-AFTRA strikes, and during a time at which there was possibly a Directors Guild of America, DGA, strike. There had been a WGA strike in 2007, 2008. That was about streaming. That was about the internet and what the internet was going to do to media. And everything that WGA imagined was possible happened. And the loopholes that we're allowed to get through in that contract are the ones that are being fought over now. Hollywood has always basically been profitable. It's been profitable for over a century. It has always been profitable enough until recently, until that sort of venture logic of we have to run the numbers down as low as possible. That's when you run into this idea of, oh, it's not good enough to just make something that people want to watch or that people want to see or people want to experience. You have to do it on as bare bones a budget as possible. You have to do it as lean as possible. And that sort of introduces what I would call like a scarcity mindset into the artistic process, which any artist could tell you is not what creates good conditions for art or storytelling or just creativity or camaraderie. And when you introduce that, you break up a lot of jobs, you take a lot of people out of work, and you take a lot of people out of community, and you reduce the opportunities for community development. So you're actually like, when you underfund art, when you take that logic to artistic production, what you are really doing is undermining a social fabric.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I wanted to circle back to the point you brought up earlier around Silicon Valley's move into Hollywood
Yeah.
and the kind of efficiency mindset. One thing that we've been talking about a lot at IFTF is this concept that I guess we didn't coin, but we've been sort of talking about it in the specific way of registers. And this idea, and basically what it means is sort of an underlying worldview that kind of shapes how we make sense of the world. And one of the things that our executive director Marina talks about is this idea of a sort of economic register or worldview that basically sees everything in economic terms and influences language itself, both how we talk about things like a marketplace of ideas or the dating market. And so I think that, within that kind of framework or view of the world, that's the best possible thing that could happen to entertainment is to have Silicon Valley come in and make it leaner and more efficient and produce a better product in the end of that. And I think as you point out in the piece, there's sort of a fairly widespread, at least skepticism about some of the average quality of content that's being produced
under that model.
But also, I think, kind of bring it to the topic that we're really looking at in 10-year forecast this year is labor, is that the labor conditions.
Hollywood is a company town. I wrote a novel called Company Town, and it's in part stemmed from the fact that, I was born in one, and Hollywood is an industry city. It is an industry city in the same way that it is a city of industry in the same way that Detroit was. That's actually a really kind of similar analog. It's full of working people who fought hard for certain rights so that they could continue to live with dignity and pleasure and possibility, right? It's really interesting when you take this fight to the people whose job it is to imagine possible stories and possible futures and possible ramifications. And when they hear on one side of a contract negotiation, oh, that will never happen, you can't actually say those words to storytellers, because immediately, and I say this as one myself, immediately we think, yes, it can, and here's how. And we go through a tiny little backcasting process of working back from there, from the disaster scenario to the conditions which precipitated it. Every contract negotiation is a small foresight exercise. And that is what sort of the WGA and SAG-AFTRA are going through right now as they are negotiating with the AMPTP and Hollywood producers and studios. They are able to imagine possible consequences. And one of the things that they are negotiating for is to have those scenarios that they've dreamt up seen as sort of valid and real. And so those scenarios that they have imagined have mostly to do with futures of labor. Hollywood is, has pioneered in a lot of ways, like a lot of unionized labor, a lot of trying to get justice for people. It is by far not necessarily the most fair or just place. It is hideously exploitive and wasteful in a lot of ways. It can be really damaging and demoralizing for a lot of people, but it often has protections that, for example, there are protections, such as they are for child actors legally. There are not protections for child content creators on YouTube or other streaming platforms. And that is how you get into the situation that we just had with, Lil Tay and other other content creators online, many of whom are subject to a lot of exploitation and so on. So it's not a perfect model, but it's a model that has rules and that people agree to abide by together in what one might call a democratic process. It's a little model. It's a little tiny scale model of cooperation and collectivity, like collective action, cooperation, and surmounting the insurmountable together. Now, that kind of spirit, that literal, what we're going to do is get together and put on a show and save the town, that spirit is the same spirit that is necessary for fighting future challenges, climate change, other economic challenges, human rights challenges, those types of things. That mindset is valuable elsewhere. So for the big fight, one of the big fights that's coming up, and where this ties into that economic model and that disintermediation, the fact that they are all the same sort of rat king problem of tails tied together and the giant hairball at the bottom of the Hollywood drain pipe, is that under that sort of lean model, that lean venture model, startup model, whatever you want to call it, under that efficiency model, with that efficiency register, where essentially you are creating numbers, not art, where the end product is just the next quarterly earnings statement or the next earnings call, where that is really the product that is being shared, sold to shareholders, not anything that you sell in a store or in a theater or whatever. It's not an experience. It's just a set of numbers. It's just the ability to say that you made more money than last quarter. When that is the logic, things like artificial intelligence or alleged artificial intelligence, like we can go back and forth about like language models being intelligent or not, that those agents begin to look very attractive. Why? Because they're not union. You don't have to pay them. You may not have to pay a writer to make them. You may not have to pay an actor to do them. You can scan actors who are extras who really need the money that day and then use their body. You can literally exploit their body and their likeness for years without paying for it. So to me, this is a repeat of a problem, or not even a problem, like a repeat of a story that we've already lived through. And it's about where labor comes from, how we view work, what we consider to be worth our time, worth our effort. And it is like an ancient story. The sweat of the brow doctrine in intellectual property law comes from Genesis. It comes from Genesis. When Adam and Eve are cast out, the sentence that they are given is, "Through the sweat of your brow shall you earn your bread." And ever since, we have viewed work as punitive. And we have viewed work as a thing that requires like a great deal of effort. I could tell you that that's like secretly why people envy artists, because we actually enjoy our jobs. And everybody feels like we're somehow like getting one over on the rest of the world. Like we're somehow cheating, this ancient law. But it does, when you dig deep enough, you find out that the belief systems, to speak to your register's point, you will find out that a lot of these stories are older than you think, and they are not trends. They are, the drivers of behavior. Like drivers can be personal and they can be core beliefs. And sometimes you have to go back digging thousands of years to find that.
one of the things that really struck me that you said was that I think it was like every labor negotiation is sort of a forecasting exercise in a way. And so I'd be curious to sort of hear you play out what's the sort of positive potential future that people are fighting for right now. And, how would we get there, I think is one question I'd be curious to ask.
I think that one of the positives that WGA and SAG are asking for is that like they want more data. They want more data about the things that they generate. They want more data about what they make and who likes it.
Yeah.
And I had said earlier that like the numbers aren't everything, and they're not, but they're something.
Yeah.
They're important. And in fact, like they are important for the same reason that like voter registration data is important. It's important to know who you're making things for. That's product information data. That's demographic data. If you were doing any other kind of product rollout, literally any other kind, you would want to know as much as possible about the people you were making things for. That's valuable information, and generating it is important. And there is no reason that the people who are making, a product in the form of a TV show or a product in the form of a game or in the form of a film shouldn't have access to that information, because once they do, we might actually have a better picture of who we are. That's always been the big data case, is like, hey, there's information out there waiting to be discovered. And if we found it, maybe we would know more about ourselves. And I think that's the case with entertainment data as well. Hey, maybe we would learn more about our attention spans, or what we really like, or who we really are, right? We just saw this happen with Barbie. Barbie is $1 billion movie. And it got to be $1 billion movie by utilizing very old production techniques from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Like it is an analog film in most every sense of the term. But, every 10 years or so, Hollywood goes through this thing where they remember that women are people and have money. And they're always surprised. And the war for storytelling, the culture wars about like, why do we need a black Ariel? Why do we need, why should Rachel Zegler be Snow White? Like all those things, those are about making, changing tacit assumptions, changing the registers, to use your language, changing the frames around who the storyteller is, who the audience is, who the avatar of the audience is, who the sort of object of affection or the object of focus is for the audience, who the audience stand-in gets to be, because those are all fights about who we are, who we are really. And that's why you see, that's one of the reasons why you see those fights. And it's one of the reasons that that information is so valuable. So I think at the metrics level, it's intensely optimistic to want to get that information. It's part of living an informed life, and it's part of creating material that speaks to more people and drawing that social fabric together. One of the things that came up in the piece was that historically, viewing entertainment together is a collective activity that draws people into a community experience wherein they determine values. They talk about right and wrong, good and evil, justice, fairness. These are big things. And when we disintermediate that, we disintermediate those conversations. And crucially, we also interrupt, even the family experience of talking about those things. Talking with your child about who a good guy or a bad guy is. Talking about redemption. Talking about love and romance and who you should date versus who you shouldn't. All that. Those are the provinces of entertainment, and giving people more information about who is actually watching can only improve it.
Ben, there was a lot to get into in there. I particularly love the insight that a contract negotiation is like a foresight exercise. But tell me, for you, having spent more time with Madeleine, what are the implications that you see for what she was talking about beyond just the entertainment sector?
Yeah, no, I love that bit as well. And I think it's very true. But in terms of the relevance outside the entertainment sector, I'd say a few things. One of the things is that, despite the image that a lot of people have of anybody who works in Hollywood is, an elite living in complete luxury and opulence. A lot of the actors and writers, at the end of the day, they're workers and they're struggling financially. I think, most of the actors who are on strike right now actually work a second job. And so it's important to see these strikes in the context of what's been dubbed the larger hot labor summer, where we're seeing workers from all sorts of industries begin to strike and to not totally separate things out from that artificially. And a way that this is kind of driven home for me is actually, Toshi, something that you pointed out to me in a conversation offline earlier about the way in which we're all creators in a way, and it really reminded me of the signal that's a few years old now, but it's really stuck with me actually, of a company that was trying to provide basically robot housekeepers. And these robots were teleoperated remotely by workers. They weren't autonomous, but the idea was basically that you would have remote operators folding clothes and cleaning up the house, and that eventually you'd get enough training data from the workers doing that you could just automate that work. And I think that's a model that is fairly widespread. You can kind of extrapolate that out and see just about anything that organizations are going to sort of use automation for, potentially to replace or reduce human labor, use human labor for training data, even if that labor happened 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. The people who created the texts that are used today, or the images that are used today for generative AI, basically, it's their labor that makes this possible, although they couldn't have consented to, for the most part, in the past at least, having their labor used in that way, because it wasn't something that could have been conceived of. So I think that's a way I'd connect it, what's happening in this industry more generally. Another thing that I think is generalizable or kind of applicable outside this industry is that one of the things that Madeline talks about in the longer interview, and that we get into, is that sort of as important as the impact on individual workers are today, there's also these kind of broader industry-wide impacts. And you heard her talk a little bit about the ways in which some of the streaming companies have prioritized efficiency and are trying to do things like eliminate having writers on set, or having writers' rooms with several writers. And whether or not you think that's true, it's true that that's inefficient for an individual production. I don't know if we should concede that, but even if that were to be true, there's a way in which these things like writers' rooms, or having writers in other aspects of the production, as a lot of the people who are on strike right now have pointed out, have these positive externalities. Basically, they serve as kind of entryways or career pathways, classrooms, training rooms for young writers, so that they can learn their craft. And I think this is definitely something that's generalizable across industries. Any organization who's thinking about using AI to reduce or remove roles should be thinking about these kind of second or third order consequences, because they could be shooting themselves in the foot over the long to medium term. The positions right now that people think are potentially automatable, whether in law or publicity or anything else, are often kind of ladders or gateways into the industry. And so, there probably needs to be some sort of like industry-wide, pre-competitive, or even just larger societal level effort to find a way to preserve these career pathways. And I guess the last thing I'll say that Madeline really helped me think about is the potential impacts on society at large. As you just heard, I don't want to overly romanticize Hollywood films of the past and the role they served, and definitely don't want to give Hollywood executives of the past too much credit. But when Madeline was saying that movies were these sort of massive shared experiences that did weave a social fabric, under the current model and some of the new emerging paradigms that we're going to hear about in a bit, there might not be a business case for that. And so I think, again, across industries, when we look at the impact of these technologies and potential paradigm shifts, we have to think about, what are the things that are socially valuable that there isn't a business case for, and figure out some way, I think, to ensure their survival. And to bring it really quickly back to labor, and Madeline referencing this fight over streaming data, I think, for a lot of the creators, the writers, the actors, they really do want to weave that social fabric, or at least they want to know that their stories are, meaningful to people, are impacting people and touching their lives. And that's part of what that data piece is about. And it also sort of speaks to a pretty profound misalignment with the motivations of a company that basically sees what they're creating, as she said, as a quarterly earnings statement. And so I think another generalizable takeaway is that companies potentially using AI to replace workers should be a concern. Obviously, loss of wages and income is 1,000% important, but we should also think about the ways in which organizations might choose to use AI to shape the jobs that they retain and make them either more or less meaningful and fulfilling, more or less robotic, to pick up again on a point from the previous conversation between Marina and Dharam. And I think, again, in the context of that previous conversation, seeing as we are sort of at a hinge point potentially about, where we can choose collectively to make decisions about who uses this tech and what for, we can kind of see that play out in this labor struggle, but also outside of the Hollywood media landscape, in these other totally different areas, which I think we're going to be talking about very soon.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to dive into some of those issues after this next part a little bit more. In particular, I think these assumptions about, thinking about like something you said there, maybe think about how we've always kind of assumed that labor, the value of it is assuming that it's fresh, right? That's like labor is a thing that emerges in the moment, and you can't like bottle it up like a preserve and put it on the shelf for later. But in some ways, what AI is doing is in some ways is not just so much replacing humans, but bottling up that labor through the machine training and through the data that was created in the first place, and through the actions that it's been trained on by humans, and all those things to be used later.